I didn't have any physicality anymore, so it's very, very hard to describe. I was very broadly expanded, but still limited somewhere. It's not that I was everything that is. That's not what it was. And I looked down from up there with a feeling of almost smiling. Like, you're never going to get me in there again. It doesn't fit at all. I can't fit. Just stop. I'm fine.
Frau Nientiedt, Sie sind psychologische Beraterin.
Ms. Nientiedt, you're a psychological counsellor. You provide first aid when someone has had a near-death experience or has experienced an after-death contact. However, you have also often provided last aid in the dying process as a hospice assistant, but also as a bereavement counsellor. In short, your work has a great deal to do with dying and death. And you're also convinced of an afterlife, because you've had your own out-of-body experiences that you can look back on. I'd like to start by asking you to talk about that.
I had two out-of-body experiences. The first was in 2009. That's when I started meditating, and at the time I went to a retreat with my son, who was also meditating. That took place in Passau. We sat there on chairs and meditated intensely. And all of a sudden, I stepped out of my body and I was sort of standing in front of myself. Although I don't really want to call it standing, because I didn't have a bodily feeling. I still had the feeling that I was connected to my material body at the back. And I also had the feeling that if I somehow move away from here, this material body will slide off the chair and my son will be terrified. That moment of perception, I'm out of the body, also terrified me. I was then very quickly back inside my body, I think out of my own fear.
By the fright?
Yes, from the feeling that the body could slide to the floor. It was at a time when I had experienced quite a lot of things in meditation, so it wasn't as concise for me. It didn't change my nature as much as the second out-of-body experience.
How did it come about?
It was in 2012. At the time, I was training as a transformation therapist. We met once a month for over a year with a training group of 30 people. At that time, we were in Bad Brücknau, which was in February 2012. It was very cold and there was snow. On the evening of one day of the training, a member of our group said, "Don't you want to do another group meditation?" And a group next door joined in, so there were 60 of us. We sat together in a large oval. There was an ethanol fire table in the middle, and we meditated together. It was very intense. I had a light experience in that meditation that moved me a lot, and it seemed to have done a lot to my body, because when I came back from that meditation, I was shaking all over my body. I was very weak, and I felt like the energy was leaking out of me. I can't describe it in any other way. My energy level was getting lower and lower, and the other members, meditators, already got up, left the room, got something to drink, and so on. They didn't pay attention to me. Then I slowly slipped off my chair, laid down on the floor, because I no longer had the strength to stand or sit. And I got very scared. It was a feeling of coldness, of emptiness, and there was nothing I could do about it. I also no longer had the strength to call, to get help, and just lay there on the floor. Then a friend came to me and said, "Johanna, what's wrong with you?" All I could do was whisper, "I'm losing all my energy." Then she called others who came up to me and sat around on the floor and tried to energize me, Reiki style. But that didn't do any good. The fear increased, and then I was out of my body from one moment to the next. I was floating under the ceiling, and I was looking down. Next to this incredible feeling, which is always described, this quietness, this vastness, this unbelievable vastness, it was also interesting to look down and see my body lying there. The people around it trying, some of them gently slapping my face and saying my name, trying to get me back. They kept energizing, they kept pushing my feet on the ground to ground me. It wasn't like my heart stopped beating or I stopped breathing. I just wasn't there anymore. I wasn't present anymore. In my condition, I had a sense of vastness. I didn't have any physicality anymore. So it's very, very hard to describe. I was very broadly expanded, but still limited somewhere. It's not that I was everything that is, that's not what it was. And I looked down from up there with a feeling of almost smiling, like, you're never going to get me in there again. It doesn't fit at all. I can't fit. Just stop. I'm fine. I tried to communicate that, but of course it didn't work. I watched for a while, and then from one moment to the next, I was back in my body. I can't say how or where, but I was just back in my body. The contrast was quite great, of this vast expanse in the confinement and the coldness of the body, and also that they couldn't comprehend at all what was actually happening to me. I couldn't talk either. I wasn't really standing next to me. I was in the body, but I felt like I wasn't connected to the body at all. It was a very strange feeling of heaviness, tightness, and coldness, of not wanting to be there in the body, of not really being there at all. And then I lay there for quite a while. The others kept trying for me, but I didn't really care. Eventually, I can't say how long after, I got up with support. The room I had at the time was about 200 meters away from the place, from the room we were in. I walked barefoot through the snow at minus 17 degrees Celsius to my room to even be able to feel myself at all. I couldn't really feel my body. I didn't connect. And I think if my friend hadn't taken such loving care of me at the time, I would have just laid down and said, I want to leave. I don't want to stay here anymore. It was a very powerful experience, which to my own amazement, I could never quite put into practice in the first few years. It was never that I thought, oh, I had an out-of-body experience. It was something that happened to me, but I couldn't put into words. I didn't talk to anyone about it either. In fact, I didn't talk about it for 7 years.
Even immediately after the meditation?
No, I wouldn't have been able to do that. It wasn't until I found the network for near-death experiences and in a conversation with a colleague that I really became aware of what actually happened to me there.
Ist mir richtig bewusst geworden, was mir da eigentlich passiert ist.
I want to come back to the out-of-body experience. Did you have a sense of time?
Nicht selber.
Not myself, meaning I didn't have a sense of time in the out-of-body state, but I could observe the timelines down there. So I can say that I didn't spend hours in that out-of-body state, but I can't say how long it was. Interestingly enough, it was not a question I asked. It was not important for me at the time who did what to me and where. That only became important later, when I was able to say precisely, there and there you did that, and you were there and there, which for me personally was proof again that this was not some other deep experience, but actually an out-of-body experience that I consciously experienced.
So you worked this out later and also discussed it with the others?
Yes, I talked about it with my friend. I was very surprised that it took so long. But how can you put into words something for which there are actually no words? There must also be a connection between the part that was floating under the ceiling and the physical part that was just lying down there. There has to be a connection again. It wasn't there for me right from the start, but it was something that was re-established over a long period of time.
Did you have a sense of self?
The sense of self was still completely there, even when completely out of the body. I didn't relate to the body anymore. I knew it was my body, but I didn't identify with it in any way. While floating under the ceiling, that sense of self was completely present. I could also feel. I had this feeling of peace, of vastness. I found that vastness very fascinating. I felt that very consciously. And from that, a kind of smile. You can't get me back in there. That's not possible at all.
Did you also experience a special quality of sensations during the out-of-body experience?
I had been meditating for many years before, and I've known this feeling of calm, of love. It's not like the deep love that's often described in near-death experiences when you're facing the light. I got to experience that in another experience. It was more of this, all is good, the way it is now, it's all good. And when I was floating under the ceiling, I didn't think, okay, at some point I'm going to be interviewed, so I have to check it out. What can I perceive and so on? But you're just in that moment. There's this feeling of vastness, this limited, limitless vastness. I can't put it in any other way. And also of warmth. I had lost the energy in my body earlier. It was cold. It was no longer cold in this state. I had no more fears. I was just a smiling consciousness that had no desire to come back. And the absurdity kind of was, hey, you're trying, but just let it go. It's not going to work anyway.
You experienced the death of your grandfather when you were 19 years old, and there were some impressive after-death contacts. Please tell me about that.
My grandpa had prostate cancer at the time with brain metastases. I really liked my grandpa, and despite my fears, I went home to his deathbed in his last 6 weeks or so. We agreed that if there's anything, he'll make himself known. And if there is something, please pick me up when I die at some point, so that I don't have to be so scared at the crossing. Of course, I didn't really believe it at the time, but I was already curious. I remember very clearly going into my shower one day. I was really standing with one leg in the shower. I had zero thoughts about my grandpa, and I was there in that situation, and suddenly I had a very strong sense of his presence. I'm often asked, how could you sense that it was your grandpa? You just know in that moment. And it's nothing I wanted at that moment. I was really, really scared. I screamed loudly, "Grandpa, go away, I'm scared." And in that moment, it was over.
Could you describe that presence? Was it a feeling of special closeness?
It's hard to put into words. It was very strong. so I didn't have any doubts about it, like maybe it's Grandpa or something. But it was kind of imposing. I had been somewhere else with my thoughts. Imposition is actually a good word. The presence filled the whole shower room, the whole bathroom, and there was no doubt whatsoever for me. It was very clear that this was my grandpa, and he had come to show me that there was something.
What made you decide to become a hospice helper? Was there a special experience?
Meine Patentante, die ist an Krebs erkrankt, an Magenkrebs.
My godmother had stomach cancer. We had always had a close relationship, and she then of course said, "You know your way around this. You're a nurse, so please come along to the talks with the doctors." And so I slipped into this supporting role. I followed her on her journey for 5 years, very intensely at the end. And I realized that there was a process of transformation going on in me. I was no longer afraid to talk about the subject. I talked to her about dying, about her own fears. And a little bit shifted in time, but also parallel, my best friend also contracted cancer. And I accompanied him with his family. And there was a lot of change happening. There was a desire in me. I want to do better. I want to know more. I only knew the nursing side beforehand. As a volunteer hospice companion, you're more on the emotional side. You're a companion on the way to finding answers to questions and the whole subject.
People who are open to the subject often mention that accompanying someone at their deathbed is a gift, because sometimes there are very touching moments. It is often reported that people change dramatically and noticeably in the last phase of their lives, perhaps in the last 14 days. You want to fix things, or the issue of death becomes more important. Have you had that experience?
Yes, I've seen the changes. Sometimes even long before their death, where I've been told afterward that, for example, the husband started sorting the files 3 months before he died, cleaning them up. This sort of thing has happened quite often, without the person having an acute illness, where he would have expected to die. I believe that our subconscious mind knows well in advance what is in store for us. I have also noticed a problem that is often present. Because the dying people want to talk about it, about their own fears, about what's coming, but the relatives don't really want to talk about it, because they want to keep the hope that a miracle might happen. You're going to get better, eat a little bit more. They want to give all their care, but they don't want to talk about dying. I've experienced really shocking situations in which the dying person was almost guarded, so to speak, so they wouldn't talk to me as a hospice nurse about the subject. I then encouraged them in the conversation with their relatives. I talked to the relatives. I've sometimes been received. I have an example for this, where the wife of the dying man said, "Yes, you're welcome to come in, but he does not yet know that he's going to die. I do not talk about dying with him." Then I went into the room. The wife was still in the kitchen, and the dying man said to me, "Don't tell my wife I'm going to die. I know it, but don't tell my wife." In the course of these conversations, I was able to bring them together to talk about it. It's a very, very painful moment when two people open up to talk about an impending death. And yet it's an opportunity to be very close to each other again, to reflect on the beautiful moments of the relationship, of life, or to forgive each other, to let go, and so on. But it's a step that both sides shy away from, at least in my experience.
In 2008, you also completed your training as a palliative nurse. Do you have experiences with deathbed visions in this occupation?
Yes, in a variety of forms. I can only confirm what is also said over and over again from different sides. The most common deathbed vision, from my experience, is that loved ones are perceived, deceased loved ones. I had a very powerful experience at a private companion. When I visited the woman at the time, it was probably 3 weeks before she died. And this woman kept calling for her mother in the evening. I was interested to know what caused her to call. Then I just asked her, "Can I ask you a question? You know, I'm a hospice nurse. I'm trying to get better and better. It would be great if I could ask you a question. It's a technique I use a lot, and no one has ever said no to this." And then I asked, if I were in her situation, and the lady knew she was going to die, then I could imagine that I would have fears too. Do you have fears? Is that why you're calling to your mother? She looked at me, smiling a little bit, very affectionately. She said, "No, I'm not afraid. When I call in the evening, my mother comes, and she's standing at the end of my bed, and she's wearing a big black cloak, and when my hour comes, she will take me under that cloak, and then I'll leave. It's so nice when my mother is there. Then I have security, the security that everything will be fine when I leave." That was very, very impressive.
In 2009 and 2014, your father and your mother passed away. Do you also experience after-death contacts?
Yes, with my mother, very, very intensely. She died in 2014, and I was at the time 700 kilometers away in Wagingen am See for a seminar. I always had the feeling that I would be there when my mother died. At that seminar, we had a small celebration the last night. When I walked into the room after the party, I looked at my phone and saw that my sister had been trying to reach me many times. I had already spoken to her on the phone at lunchtime, and she had told me that our mother had slight abdominal pain and a little diarrhea, and that she had gone to the doctor, and he had told her to rest and drink a little more. So I wasn't terribly worried, but when I looked at my cell phone and saw the many calls, I had the feeling that something was wrong. I called, and my sister just said, "Mother has died." It was just extremely painful, and it pulled the rug out from under my feet at that moment. I then said I couldn't talk. I hung up and went into the hallway and sobbed loudly, and it was just incomprehensible. My mother was 88 years old, and you have to expect it in some way, but when it happens, it's completely different. When I was sobbing, the seminar instructor came and took me in her arms. Then other participants came and formed a ring around me, and they all reassured me. In all of this, I suddenly heard my mother's voice, and I felt her hand on my back. I remember very well that I said to the others, "Be quiet," because it was a murmur. I wanted to hear my mother's voice. And then my mother spoke, and I found it remarkable, because I heard her speak in her voice. In all the other encounters later, it was more of a telepathic perception. But then I really heard my mother's voice telling me that it was good that she had left, and that she was fine, and that she had left for me, because she would clear the way for me. I didn't understand that at all. At first I just heard my mother's voice, and I felt her closeness. That was unbelievably good at that moment. Everything else was hidden for now. That evening, I was completely beside myself. I couldn't have gone home alone, and had also driven the 700 kilometers with a colleague in her car. So I said with a heavy heart, "Okay, I'll stay here and drive back with you the next afternoon." Of course, saying goodbye to my mother was incredibly important to me. So my boyfriend at the time arranged for me to go to the morgue. When I got back, it was 11:30 or something. I remember standing with him in front of the morgue, and we were waiting for the mortician who had the key to the morgue. My mother was there. She talked to me. Inside, she told me everything was fine. I can't remember the individual sentences exactly, but she was talking to me, and she again put her hand on me. It was physically tangible to me.
Was that her voice again that you heard?
No, it was the other way. It was more telepathic now. And of course, I have thought about it a lot, and I think hearing her voice in that moment, I knew she had died, was important to realize what had happened, because I was in a kind of shock. If I had just heard that telepathically inside me, I might have denied it, but that's how it was. Anyway, she said to me in front of the hall, "If you go in there, watch your calf." Okay, watch your calf. I went in there, and my mother's body was beautifully laid out. But it wasn't her. It was really just this shell, because my mother was with me. I felt her physically. I heard her voice inside me. It was incredibly loving. And there was her shell. I then could find a level within myself to thank that shell for giving my mother the opportunity to touch me, to hold me, to feed me, and all these things. It was a very, very interesting experience. And in that hall, of course, it was very cold. Logically, I think it was 4 degrees or so, and it was still very warm outside. July 18th had been a hot day, and I was relatively lightly clothed. And then, when I was standing there at the bed of the body, at the laying out, I froze very terribly from the cold inside me because of the death of my mother. But my calf was rosy. It was alive. It was all in complete contrast with the rest of my body. This was a kind of validation for me afterwards. Ah, there is something. I don't know how, but there's something happening. Since then, it's a kind of validation for things that I'm doing or things like that. I always say, for me, it's the confirmation from the spirit world. Then my calf tingles.
Watch your calf. You also talked about the message that your mother wanted to clear the way for you. Did that clear up for you later?
Yes, that has been clarified. And it was good that she gave me the message, because at the time, I didn't know what to do with it. And it was again this feeling, I didn't make up anything, but I was given a message. A year later, I moved to southern Germany. After my mother died, I had the need to completely change myself. I didn't know exactly where to go, and I didn't know exactly why. But then I moved to Dietenheim in June 2015. I never would have done this if my mother had been alive. That made a lot of sense afterward, because I also took over the hospice work there again. For me, it was something that came full circle.
You're also involved in bereavement counseling. Have you had the experience that many mourners, especially close family members, experience after-death contacts? And if they are open to it, also want to talk about it?
Yes, that last point is a very good addition. From my perspective, almost all people have experienced some form of near-death contact. Of course, this may be because I am open and have specifically asked about such things. I had an impressive experience when I met a woman whose daughter had died as an adult. I was called to see that woman, and she really sat there in shock. I sat beside her at the funeral service at that very early stage. It's also important to just be there, to just be present. So it wasn't even possible to start a conversation with this woman. And then, after a while, I asked, "Do you have any idea where your daughter might be now?" It was as if this woman had woken up from her rigor. Before, she had just looked straight ahead. Then she looked at me and told me that her son had already died 5 years earlier, and that at that time she had laid down on the sofa in the evening because she couldn't sleep. She had been lying there a lot, and the light of the street lamp fell through the curtains that were similarly filigree. And all of a sudden, a light appeared in the middle of the room. And in that light, in what she described as a holographic whirling, the head and the upper body of her son was seen. And she lay very still, so as not to scare away the apparition, and she watched it. It went on over a relatively long period of time. I don't remember for sure, half an hour or so. There was that presence in the room, and that was wonderful for her, of course, and she was able to experience that more often that her son showed up. I was with this woman for a long time in grief, and she was so grateful because she never talked about it with anyone, and now there was someone she could talk to about these things. And after a certain period of time, she also had contact with her daughter, who she then saw. And from my experience, it's not that often that people actually see. It's very, very often that sense of presence, as I've experienced it, or signs that are given. That butterflies appear, that birds appear, that a cat comes, that sort of thing. But also, and I was able to experience this myself, that taps turned on, a ceiling fan started to rotate, even though it was not operated by the light switch, but you had to pull the string directly, that there were noises in the cupboards, even in the presence of my children, who were a bit scared at the beginning. There's so much that happens, and unfortunately, it's so seldom told about. There's something very, very comforting about it, and also when combined with near-death experiences.
You have experienced a great deal yourself, and you have experienced a great deal with other people. So, what is your summary? What happens when you die and after death?
Also für mich ist das Sterben stark davon abhängig.
For me, dying is very much dependent on where you are in your consciousness process. Whether there are still old processes that are fermenting feelings of guilt. I'd like to add an example. I spoke to a person relatively shortly before he died who cried, who said, "I've been an alcoholic all my life, and my family has suffered as a result, and I can no longer cope with it. I'm going to die, and I can no longer cope with it." That was a very heavy burden for him, and if there had been more time, we might have been able to work it out in conversation, but there just was no more time. And so I believe that the state of how we have cleaned up within us, the way we lived, influences how we die. Personally, I believe that after the transition, we create where we go ourselves out of the unconscious, and certainly out of the conscious. After all, there are also negative near-death experiences, and the positive near-death experiences also occur in different variants. And from my point of view, this has an influence on how we think about it. I recently summed up for myself what is actually the most important thing I can give a person. And if we look at the negative near-death experiences, which can also be hellish, I think it's important that a dying person has heard of the fact that there is a light, that there's a way forward, even though they might not believe it at the moment. If a person's heard that, and then maybe they had a negative near-death experience, and they remember, oh, there was something about that light, I'm asking for light, then those experiences dissolve, at least from what I've been told. And that's why I think that's a very important aspect. And that's why I'd like to encourage people on their deathbeds. When someone's dying, and even if they're already comatose, you can still talk about near-death experiences, about that transition, about light, about love, even the tunnel, and so on. Because being in a coma doesn't mean you don't perceive anything. On the contrary, there seems to be an expansion of consciousness in which everything is perceived, the feelings and also the thoughts, and of course what is spoken. And in that way, it has been heard before. I once had a teacher who told me, you don't have to memorize this, you just have to have heard it. That seems to be one of my goals, to give this message to people.
You were born with a great fear of death, as you say. Are you still afraid of death today?
No, I'm not afraid of death. But I like living now. I also had a very intense light experience, and after the light experience, I always had a great longing back. That's when I wanted to die. Not that I was going to kill myself, not that. But when I looked at the starry sky, for example, there was a longing that was almost impossible to bear, and that subsided. I like to live. I live consciously. I see a task for myself in what I do. And when it comes to the point that I cross over, I cross over. I wish, of course, that I could do it as beautifully as possible, painlessly with my loved ones. But it doesn't scare me.
Let's talk about the light experience. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? How did that happen?
I read Paramahansa Yogananda's book, Autobiography of a Yogi, in 2007. It was also a defining moment in my life, because I opened myself up very consciously to the whole subject of spirituality. I started to meditate, and I'm a person who sometimes overdoes it a little bit. And I sat down in the dark for an hour in the morning and in the evening and meditated. I just tried not to have any thoughts. And it was still relatively at the beginning of that time. I can't exactly say when. Then I was back in the dark, also in the inner dark, in a state of just being. I'd let go of all thoughts pretty well, and just, I'd say, floated in space, although that's certainly not real, but that's what it felt like. No requirement, just a feeling of being really calm. And then I saw something in the distance. I like to compare it to the moon, as if the full moon were there in the sky coming toward me. And it kept getting bigger and bigger, and shining brighter and brighter, and getting so close that it was kind of in front of me. And the moon, which was huge, was in front of me, and then from one moment to the next, it sucked me in. I was in an incredible light, in a safety, in a beauty. There are no words to describe it. It was incredible. The interesting thing about it was, I had already had a consciousness there in the darkness before. There was a self-consciousness. And that self-consciousness was sucked into that light and dissolved. Not in a way that I no longer had self-consciousness, but in a way that it went into every particle of light in this giant sphere. I was everything. I was all light. I was also all knowledge without knowing anything concrete. It was beyond questions. I understood everything and I simply was. And it was just unbelievably beautiful. At some point, I can't tell you a time, these I particles started to compress again, to become an I again. Then I was thrown out of that sphere, and the sphere went away. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to go back to that state. It was like being left. Like a child standing and the mother leaves it behind. There was loneliness, but at the same time a very great gratitude for having experienced it. And then when I came back from my meditation again, there it was. Yes, I experienced something unbelievable. I can't really tell anyone about this, because I think you can only really understand if you've experienced it. But how do I deal with it? What was that? It occupied me for a very, very long time. And the longing to return to that state was the greatest thing that remained of it. At the same time, however, I also developed a certainty that I would experience that state again when I crossed over. It's just a knowledge that's there. I can't tell where it came from.
An experience in which, of course, much of what we experience here in terms of suffering must be put into perspective.
Yes, definitely. I remember saying to my boyfriend at the time, I wish I was over there. And that almost made him a bit aggressive. It's understandable that our relatives, of course, want to keep us here on Earth. But there's something that's even stronger, that attracts us even more than the relationships on Earth. It's just like that.
When all suffering is put into perspective, it can, of course, also be comforting for people with a particularly difficult fate.
Yes. That was one of the most powerful experiences, when I had the gift of being able to hold several grief workshops with people with disabilities. It is not the norm that there are such grief workshops, that these people even have the opportunity to speak about this so deeply and intensely. And we sat there, and then of course the subject went directly to the subject of dying. And a woman sitting obliquely opposite me, she was always a little bit more depressed, a little bit more sad, because of the grief of not being able to live so many possibilities here on Earth. Maybe a partnership, a different job, a different social perception, and so on. That too is mourned by people with disabilities. And this woman was in great mourning. Now, when we were talking about dying, I was talking about my out-of-body experience and what other people have experienced in near-death experiences. And all of a sudden, she's beaming at me, and she's like, am I whole? Is my head whole again? And that's when I first became aware of what it means to have a perspective, to be completely, in quotation marks, normal. And I think it's important to get this message across everywhere. That was shown to me once again very clearly.
Ms. Nientiedt, I wish you all the best and every success in all your endeavors. Thank you very much for the discussion.
I thank you for the opportunity. I hope it helps people who are watching the video. Thank you.